Imagine a single infrastructure project that involves over 150 countries.
Yeah, that number alone is staggering.
Right. And it touches nearly 75% of the global population.
It's just massive.
And it accounts for over half of the world's GDP as of 2025. Just let the sheer scale of those numbers sink in for a second. We aren't talking about a regional trade agreement or a standard diplomatic treaty.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a physical and digital rewiring of the entire globe. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking you on a journey to understand exactly how the map of the world is being redrawn right beneath our feet.
Exactly. And it is great to be here.
Our mission for this deep dive is to cut through the immense amount of geopolitical noise and extract exactly what this massive global project is, where it came from, and how it is fundamentally changing the world. And to do that, we are relying on a highly comprehensive stack of research and historical data detailing China's Belt and Road Initiative, or, the BRI.
Starting with that sheer scale is essential, because when we look at the data synthesized in these sources, the Belt and Road Initiative isn't just a series of highways or deepwater ports.
Right, it's way more than that.
It is a sprawling economic, geopolitical, and technological framework that has evolved drastically since it was first announced. Synthesizing this vast amount of information is crucial because the BRI is so often oversimplified in daily headlines.
Yeah, you see a headline and it's just about a single bridge or a loan, but it misses the forest for the trees.
Precisely. We're going to break down the hard data on where the money is actually flowing, what is physically being built, and the profound, sometimes volatile, global reactions it has triggered.
Exactly. We are going to act as your guides today. First, we will trace the origins of the BRI. It didn't just drop out of the sky a decade ago. There is a deep, fascinating historical context here.
Really deep history, yeah.
Next, we are going to map out its physical and digital footprint because it is absolutely not just about concrete.
Concrete is just the start.
We are talking about fiber optic networks and even commercial shipping lanes carved through Arctic ice. Then, we are going to tackle the highly debated economics, specifically diving into the mechanics of the whole debt trap controversy.
Which is a heavy topic on its own.
Very heavy. And finally, we will look at the real-world bumps in the road, from environmental paradoxes to shifting global alliances, as we sit here in early 2026.
It's a massive undertaking, but a deeply necessary one. If you want to understand global trade patterns, international tech standards, or the underlying tension in modern geopolitics, you have to understand the mechanics of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does a project this unfathomably large even start? We officially date the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative to Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013.
Right.
But projects of this magnitude, projects that require trillions of dollars in capital, they don't just happen overnight. Where did the blueprint actually come from?
To understand that 2013 launch, we have to rewind the clock back to the 1950s, shortly after China's socialist reform.
Wow, the 50s.
Yeah. Under Mao Zedong, China was technically making foreign investments, primarily in North Korea, Vietnam, and several African nations that were undergoing independence movements at the time. But the context is everything here.
What was different?
Those investments were microscopic compared to today. Driven by isolationist policies and a massive push for self-reliance, China simply didn't have the capital for major global infrastructure.
Right.
By 1979, China's GDP per capita was roughly $271 US. Their total foreign exchange reserves were a mere $840 million.
Just to put that $271 per capita into perspective for you listening, that wasn't even enough to buy a standard color television back then.
Exactly.
The idea that this same country would be funding high-speed rail networks in Europe and deep-water ports in South America just a few decades later is staggering.
It is an incredible economic shift. The real pivot point highlighted in the research is December 1978 with Deng Xiaoping's open-door policy.
That was the big change.
That was the moment China transitioned toward a market-based economy. What followed were decades of unprecedented, sustained economic growth.
Which gave them the cash they needed.
Right. And that growth eventually led to former General Secretary Jiang Zemin's Go Out policy, which was a specific directive encouraging Chinese construction companies and state-owned enterprises to look abroad for contracts.
Basically telling them, go find work outside our borders.
Exactly. So when President Xi Jinping stood up at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan in September 2013 and announced the Silk Road economic belt, it wasn't a spontaneous idea.
It was already in motion.
It was the culmination of decades of evolving economic strategy. It was the moment China finally had the industrial capacity, the massive capital reserves, and the political will to export its development model on a planetary scale.
And there is a fascinating branding detail in the sources regarding the name itself, which tells you a lot about how carefully this project is managed on the global stage.
Oh, the name change.
Yeah, if you were following international news a decade ago, you probably remember this being called One Belt, One Road, or OBEOR.
Right.
But the official English translation changed in 2016 to the Belt and Road Initiative. Why the subtle shift there?
What's fascinating here is the power of language in international diplomacy. The original Chinese phrase literally translates to one belt, one road. And the official full name originally included the word strategy.
Strategy?
Yes. The data points out that Chinese officials realized the word strategy, coupled with the emphasis on the word one, was starting to cause suspicion abroad.
Sounds a bit dominating.
Exactly. It sounded too unilateral, perhaps too aggressive to Western ears. So they intentionally opted for the word initiative in the official English translation to soften its image.
Making it sound friendlier.
Right, more inclusive, open, and collaborative. Interestingly, though, if you read Chinese language media today, it is still almost exclusively referred to as One Belt, One Road.
It's a brilliant piece of diplomatic marketing, honestly. But moving past the branding, what are the actual stated objectives? I mean, why spend trillions of dollars building infrastructure outside of your own sovereign borders?
The official documents, specifically a detailed 2015 action plan, lay out several core pragmatic goals. First, they aim to close the global infrastructure gap.
Which is huge.
It is. Developing nations in Asia, Africa, and South America desperately need reliable roads, power grids, and ports to grow their economies. But traditional Western institutions have often been slow, overly bureaucratic, or entirely reluctant to fund them.
So China steps in.
Yes. Second, and this is crucial for Beijing, the BRI creates new markets for Chinese firms. Over the last few decades, China has produced a massive amount of steel, cement, and engineering expertise. The BRI channels that excess industrial capacity overseas.
Keeping their domestic industries humming.
Exactly. Third, it increases China's access to vital natural resources by building the roads and railways that bring those resources back home. And fourth, it helps balance China's own domestic economy. By building overland routes westward, it connects its historically less developed western regions, like Xinjiang, directly to booming global markets.
And for you listening, whether you are managing a corporate supply chain, tracking global equities, or simply wondering why the shipping costs for your online orders fluctuate, the BRI is fundamentally designed to change how fast and cheap those goods move across the globe.
It is quite literally rewiring the circulatory system of modern commerce.
So the ambition is clearly there on paper. But when you actually start pouring concrete and laying asphalt, the map gets a little confusing, especially the naming convention. You hear belt and road, and you immediately picture a highway belt and a driving road.
Yes, the naming convention is famously counterintuitive.
It really is.
When we hear belt, we naturally think of a continuous loop, maybe even a shipping lane wrapping around a continent. But in the context of the BRI, the belt refers to the overland routes.
So the belt is the land.
Correct. We are talking about the massive railways, the transcontinental highways, and the energy pipelines stretching all the way across the Eurasian landmass. The road, conversely, refers to the maritime sea routes, specifically what they call the 21st century Maritime Silk Road.
Okay, let's start with those overland corridors, the belt. The research outlines several massive arteries, but one really stands out in terms of sheer scale and strategic importance, and that's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC.
Yes, CPEC is massive.
We're looking at an investment originally valued at around $62 billion. That isn't just a road. That is a nation-building level of investment.
CPEC is widely considered the flagship overland project of the entire initiative. It is a sprawling, complex network of modern transportation highways, energy infrastructure, and special economic zones built throughout Pakistan.
But there's a bigger reason for it, right?
Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, CPEC isn't just about developing Pakistan's economy or helping a regional ally. It is a vital geopolitical workaround for Beijing.
Right, because if you look at a map of global trade routes, this is where we run into the Malacca dilemma.
A huge vulnerability for them.
The Strait of Malacca is essentially a one-lane highway for global shipping located near Singapore and Malaysia. An enormous percentage of China's energy imports from the Middle East and its trade exports to the rest of the world must pass through that narrow waterway.
Yes.
If there's a geopolitical conflict, someone parks a naval blockade there, and China's energy supply is effectively choked off overnight.
Exactly. The Malacca dilemma is a strategic vulnerability that has kept Chinese planners up at night for decades. CPEC provides an elegant physical solution.
By going around it entirely.
By building deep water infrastructure at the Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea, right at the edge of the Middle East, and connecting it via highways and pipelines all the way up through Pakistan and directly into China's western border, Beijing secures a direct overland route.
It's brilliant from a strategic standpoint.
It effectively bypasses the Strait of Malacca entirely. So a massive percentage of their energy can be offloaded in Pakistan and piped up to China without ever touching that vulnerable maritime choke point. It's a strategic insurance policy masked as a regional economic development project.
That is fascinating. And the overland routes aren't just going south. They are going straight through the heart of the Eurasian landmass.
To Europe.
Right. The research highlights the new Eurasian land bridge, which connects China to Europe via Kazakhstan. And the mechanics of this are incredible, because you can't just run a standard train from Beijing to Berlin.
You'd think you could, but you can't.
Right. The countries in between, specifically former Soviet states, use different widths for their railway tracks.
Right, the rail gauges don't match. This historical quirk used to make overland freight painfully slow.
So how did they fix it?
Under the BRI, China has heavily invested in massive dry ports, most notably at Kordos, right on the border of China and Kazakhstan.
Dry ports.
Yes, these facilities are logistical marvels where massive cranes physically lift cargo containers off trains using standard Chinese rail gauges and seamlessly drop them onto trains using the wider Soviet-era gauges.
That is wild.
This allows freight to keep moving all the way to Germany with minimal delay. It transforms what used to be a fragmented, inefficient rail journey into a viable, high-speed alternative to ocean freight.
And speaking of ocean freight, that brings us to the road time, the Maritime Silk Road. This is where we see China deploying massive amounts of capital into deep water ports globally.
Heavy investments.
The sources detail specific investments in places like Piraeus in Greece and Trieste in Italy.
The maritime strategy is about fundamentally reorganizing global shipping lanes to be more efficient and more centered around Chinese trade. The port of Piraeus is the prime example.
In Greece.
Yes. Over the last decade, Chinese state-backed companies have poured hundreds of millions of euros into upgrading and expanding that Greek port.
And what's the geographic advantage there?
By bringing goods through the Suez Canal and docking them directly in southern Europe at Piraeus or the port of Trieste in Italy cargo, can then be immediately loaded onto those new rail networks and sent directly into the heart of Europe.
Which drastically changes the economics of international shipping. Instead of a cargo ship sailing out of the Suez Canal, going all the way around the Iberian Peninsula and up to northern European ports like Rotterdam or Hamburg, they just drop it in Greece.
Exactly.
The data suggests this southern route cuts transport times from Asia to Europe by at least 4 days.
4 days.
And in the logistics world, 4 days is an eternity.
It is huge.
It saves massive amounts of money on fuel, lowers maritime insurance premiums, and allows manufacturers to operate much tighter just-in-time supply chains. Not to mention, it significantly reduces carbon emissions.
It's a logistical game changer, and you can see why those traditional Northern European hubs are deeply concerned about losing their historical dominance. It creates an entirely new center of gravity for European logistics.
But the infrastructure doesn't stop at the water's edge. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Belt and Road Initiative isn't just concrete, asphalt, and deep-water cranes.
Not anymore.
It is also fiber optics, artificial intelligence, and even Arctic ice. Let's dig into the Digital Silk Road.
The Digital Silk Road was formally announced in 2015, and it represents a fascinating, highly sophisticated, and heavily contested component of the BRI.
What does it actually involve?
It involves the aggressive development and export of smart city technology, 5G telecommunications networks, data centers, and thousands of miles of undersea internet cables. By 2018, estimated investments in these digital projects outside of China had already reached a staggering $79 billion.
Wow.
China is laying this infrastructure heavily across the global south, often in developing nations where private Western telecom providers haven't been willing or able to invest the necessary capital.
This is where the alarm bells really start ringing for Western governments. You look at the geopolitical tension here, and the fear is that China isn't just exporting cheap internet access.
Right, the surveillance fear.
They are exporting the architecture of their own domestic surveillance system, often referred to as the Great Firewall. The research explicitly cites a major leak from February 2024 involving a Chinese government contractor called iSoon.
That was a significant leak.
This leak allegedly detailed widespread hacking campaigns targeting the critical digital infrastructure of several partner countries. The U.S. and its allies look at that and argue that integrating Chinese tech into a nation's core telecom grid is a massive national security risk.
That is the core friction point defining the global tech war right now. However, if we look at the academic analysis provided in the sources, there is a distinct counter-narrative.
Let's hear the other side.
The material cites a comprehensive 2024 academic literature review led by researcher Christopher Foster. That review analyzed the actual data on the ground and argued that many of the negative fears regarding Chinese digital expansion in the global south are, at least currently, highly speculative.
So they aren't finding hard proof.
Right. They are not heavily backed by empirical evidence. The researchers pointed out that while the theoretical risk of espionage exists, there is also virtually no specific evidence yet about the positive local economic impacts either.
It's just too new.
It is essentially a wild frontier space. It's rapidly developing, heavily subsidized, and the long-term impact on global data privacy is still an open question.
It's a space that is evolving faster than the regulations can keep up. And briefly, before we shift to the financial mechanics of all this, we have to mention the Ice Silk Road.
Which sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel.
It really does. But it is a very real, very strategic partnership, primarily between China and Russia, to develop commercial shipping routes through the warming Arctic Circle.
As global temperatures rise and the Arctic sea ice recedes for longer periods each summer, the Northern Sea route becomes increasingly viable for commercial shipping.
And the geographic advantage there is massive. If you can take a cargo ship from Shanghai, go straight up through the Bering Strait, and sail across the top of Russia to Europe, you completely bypass the Suez Canal, the Malacca Strait, and the geopolitical volatility of the Middle East entirely.
Exactly. It offers an incredibly fast shortcut between Asia and Europe. Chinese companies are already deploying specialized icebreakers like the Zhulong fleet, conducting commercial trial runs, and heavily partnering with Russia on massive Arctic oil and liquefied natural gas exploration projects.
That's a huge shift in global shipping.
It is an environmentally sensitive and highly controversial route, but the economic and strategic incentives to open it up are immense.
Okay, so we have overland belts, bypassing maritime choke points, deep-water roads reorganizing European shipping, digital cables routing the world's data, and icebreakers carving new paths through the Arctic.
It's a lot.
The obvious question you have to be asking is who on earth is paying for all of this? We are talking about trillions of dollars in upfront capital. Let's follow the money.
The financing for the BRI is a colossal, highly orchestrated effort routed through a few primary vehicles.
Where does it start?
First, you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, which was essentially created in parallel with the BRI to act as a multilateral development bank. Then you have the Silk Road Fund, a state-owned investment fund established with $40 billion specifically earmarked to inject equity into these projects.
But that's not the bulk of it, right?
No. The real heavy lifting, the vast majority of the lending, is done by China's massive policy banks, specifically the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, as well as their state-owned commercial banks.
When you look at the timeline and the data, the funding really surged in 2014 and 2015, right after the announcement, and peaked around 2016 and 2017 when the mega projects were breaking ground.
Right.
But then the lending significantly dipped, especially during the economic contraction of the COVID-19 pandemic, hitting a low point in 2023.
Which was a major recalibration.
Interestingly, by 2023, there was a massive strategic shift toward those maritime investments we discussed, making up roughly 60% of the total investment volume that year.
They pivoted hard to the ports.
But whenever we talk about BRI funding, we inevitably hit the most contentious phrase in this entire deep dive: debt-trap diplomacy.
Indeed. And it is crucial that we examine the mechanics of this debate closely, looking at both the geopolitical accusations and their rigorous academic rebuttals exactly as they are presented in the research.
Let's start with the accusation, because it is a narrative that has dominated Western headlines for years. The claim, primarily originating from U.S. and Western governments, along with several prominent think tanks, is that China intentionally burdens developing nations with massive, opaque, and ultimately unsustainable loans.
The theory is that Beijing knows these countries will inevitably default on the debt.
Right.
When they do, China swoops in and seizes strategic national assets like a critical deepwater port, a national railway, or a valuable rare earth mine, essentially engaging in a modern form of financial neocolonialism.
The narrative suggests it is a deliberate predatory strategy. And there is definitely high-level political pushback from borrowing nations that fuels this perspective.
Who comes to mind?
The research highlights the late Tanzanian President John Magufuli, who famously and outright rejected a massive BRI port project in his country.
He was very vocal about it.
Very. He publicly called the financing conditions, which allegedly included a 99-year lease and a 33-year guarantee on the port operations, exploitative, famously stating that such terms could only be accepted by mad people.
That's a strong statement.
Furthermore, a very recent 2025 study of the Lowy Institute added intense fuel to this fire. That study found that for 54 developing countries around the world, their debt repayments to China now actually exceed what they owe to traditional Western lenders in the Paris Club.
And just as a quick refresher for those listening, the Paris Club is that informal group of mostly Western creditor nations, places like the US, the UK, France, and Germany, that historically dictated the global terms for restructuring sovereign debt. The Lowy Institute study explicitly stated that the sheer volume and structure of Chinese lending has actively driven debt sustainability problems globally, pushing many vulnerable nations to the brink of default.
That is the foundation of the debt trap narrative. But this raises an important question. Does the actual financial data support the theory of deliberate predatory asset seizure?
That's the key issue.
The source material provides a highly detailed, robust rebuttal from the global academic community. Researchers digging into the loan ledgers, scholars like Deborah Brudegam at Johns Hopkins University, and research firms like the Rhodium Group have extensively studied thousands of these individual loan contracts.
And what did they find?
Their conclusion is stark. They call the debt trap concept largely a myth or a geopolitical meme.
So what is their evidence for calling it a myth? Because the debt loads are clearly real.
The debt is absolutely real, but the intent and the outcome are entirely different from the narrative. Their research indicates that actual asset seizures are exceedingly rare. In fact, they could barely find any examples of China legally seizing an asset due to default. Instead of foreclosing on countries when they can't pay, China routinely writes off the debts entirely, extends the repayment periods, or restructures the loans to keep the countries afloat.
Do the sources give an example of that?
Yeah. The data shows that in August 2022 alone, China outright forgave 23 separate interest-free loans for 17 different African nations.
But what about the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka? Because whenever the debt trap theory is brought up, Hambantota is the universal case study.
Always.
The story goes that Sri Lanka couldn't pay its debts, so China seized the port for 99 years.
Yes, Hambantota is the poster child for the accusation. But when academics from the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Lowy Institute reconstructed the timeline of that deal, a very different picture emerged.
What did they find?
The crisis there was actually driven by the severe misconduct and political ambitions of local Sri Lankan elites, combined with excessive borrowing on traditional Western-dominated capital markets. Sri Lanka was drowning in debt long before the port failed.
Interesting.
In fact, academic Carrie Brown notes in the research that the failure of Hambantota forced China to commit more money, take on more financial risk, and become deeply entangled in volatile local politics just to salvage the project. It was a massive headache for Beijing, the exact opposite of a brilliantly executed predatory trap.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the reality of this international financing is just incredibly complex. Academic Jeremy Garlick points out in the sources that for many impoverished nations in the global south, China is simply the only willing lender.
Traditional Western investors and institutions like the World Bank have often been highly reluctant to invest in places with high political risk.
Places like Pakistan, Cambodia, or Tajikistan, due to stringent governance and environmental requirements, China stepped into that massive void.
They took the risk.
And Garlick argues there is no real empirical reason to believe the BRI framework is inherently worse for a developing country's debt sustainability than traditional lending from the IMF or the Paris Club, but it undeniably carries heavy risks.
Risk for China, too.
Fitch Ratings even issued a warning that Chinese state banks themselves might face severe asset quality problems in the near future because they are taking on so much toxic risk from these developing nations.
It's a high-stakes, highly leveraged financial ecosystem. China is offering a rapid, alternative development model that doesn't require Western oversight. But the sheer volume of that lending means both the borrower nations and the Chinese state banks backing them are walking a very precarious financial tightrope.
It's a fragile balance.
And as we move to the final section of our deep dive, we see that sovereign debt isn't the only risk involved in building megaprojects across 150 countries. There are profound, real-world, on-the-ground consequences.
Concrete problem.
Exactly. And the source material covering 2024 and 2025 shows some serious, undeniable bumps in the road. Let's look at the environmental fallout and the intense governance issues.
The environmental impact of the BRI is a fascinating paradox.
How so?
On one hand, historically, the initiative has been a massive global funder of fossil fuels. Look at the numbers from 2018. Coal projects accounted for a staggering 42% of China's overseas investment.
That's almost half.
There are serious documented concerns from environmental organizations like the WWF regarding massive ecosystem disruption, deforestation for rail lines, and severe air pollution from these power plants.
Yet the data also shows a massive recent pivot. According to the Green Finance and Development Center, 2023 was officially the BRI's greenest year on record.
A huge shift.
China poured $7.9 billion into overseas solar and wind projects in places like Brazil and Indonesia, and formally pledged to stop funding new overseas coal plants. However, critics are quick to point out a loophole.
There's always a loophole.
Some previously approved coal plants, like a massive facility in Indonesia that came online in early 2024, are still being built under older contracts.
It's a complex, messy transition away from fossil fuels. But while the environmental debate is largely focused on long-term impacts, the governance and safety issues present a much more immediate, tragic hurdle for the initiative.
The day-to-day operations.
When you dig into the local implementation of these projects, the speed of construction often clashes with safety standards. The text highlights a deeply sobering incident from late 2024. In November of that year, the massive concrete canopy of the Novi Sad railway station in Serbia suddenly collapsed, killing 15 people.
That is horrific. And the context around that collapse is exactly what critics of the BRI point to regarding governance. That specific railway station had just undergone a massive 3-year renovation supported by BRI funding.
It was part of the broader Budapest-Belgrade railway mega project.
Right, and it was carried out by a consortium of Chinese state-owned construction companies. While the official cause of the engineering failure remains under strict investigation, the disaster sparked massive, furious protests across Serbia.
People were understandably angry.
The public anger wasn't just about the collapse. It was directed at the alleged government corruption, the bypassing of local safety regulations, and the highly opaque nature of the contracts signed with the Chinese developers.
The tragedy in Serbia is an extreme example, but it highlights a broader systemic issue. A comprehensive 2021 analysis by the research lab Aid Data looked at the entire portfolio of the BRI and found that a staggering 35% of its infrastructure projects faced major implementation problems.
35%.
We're talking about widespread corruption scandals, severe environmental hazards, public protests that halt construction, and deeply troubling labor violations.
The sources specifically mentioned detailed reports from the advocacy group China Labor Watch, which documented the severe mistreatment of Chinese migrant workers who were sent overseas to build these projects.
What did they find?
These reports allege confiscated passports, forced excessive overtime, and highly unsafe, unregulated working conditions.
This raises an important question. How does a global initiative sustain its momentum when it faces these kinds of intense local backlashes, tragic implementation failures, and a mountain of international debt?
It's a lot to handle.
Because it's not just local citizens protesting, there is massive, organized geopolitical pushback occurring right now.
The geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically since the BRI was launched in 2013. We are definitely seeing the global map of the initiative shrinking in some key strategic areas.
The U.S. and its G7 allies definitely noticed.
Recognizing they were losing ground in the global south, they launched direct counter-initiatives like the Blue Dot Network and the Build Back Better World initiative, specifically designed to offer transparent, high-standard alternatives to Chinese funding.
Furthermore, major regional powers like India have strictly opposed the BRI from its inception.
Why is that?
Primarily because the flagship China-Pakistan Economic Corridor physically runs through regions of Kashmir that India claims as its sovereign territory.
But what's really striking in the recent data from 2024 and 2025 is the sheer number of high-profile official exits from the initiative. Countries aren't just complaining, they are formally packing their bags.
Exactly. The text lists several highly significant national withdrawals that have dealt a blow to the BRI's prestige.
By coup.
The Philippines effectively dropped out in late 2023, halting major railway projects as maritime tensions between Manila and Beijing severely flared over territorial disputes in the South China Sea.
Then there was Italy.
Italy, which was a massive diplomatic coup for Beijing because it was the only G7 nation to ever join the initiative, formally exited in early 2024. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni bluntly stated that the project brought no real economic benefit to Italy's exports.
Ouch.
Panama left the initiative in February 2025, and arguably the biggest recent blow, Brazil, a massive BRICS economy, made global headlines by opting out of the initiative entirely in October 2024.
That is a lot of significant, diverse economies actively pulling the plug. So how is Beijing reacting to this wave of departures? Are they dialing back the ambition?
Far from it. What we are seeing is a strategic realignment, not a retreat.
Where are they going?
While they are losing ground in Western-aligned or structurally skeptical nations in Europe and parts of Asia, they are doubling down aggressively in other regions. They are deeply cementing long-term relationships across Africa, the Middle East, and South America.
Like the port in Peru.
Exactly. A perfect example of this pivot from the text is the massive Shanxi port in Peru, which President Xi personally inaugurated in late 2024. It's a billion-dollar megaport that will drastically cut shipping times between South America and Asia.
They are adapting.
China is pivoting its vast resources to areas where the desperate desire for modern infrastructure simply outweighs the geopolitical anxiety of partnering with Beijing.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at staggering numbers. Trillions of dollars, 150 countries, transforming global trade.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
We've seen that the Belt and Road Initiative is far more than just a series of regional roads and bridges. It is a profound, incredibly ambitious attempt to fundamentally redraw the global supply chain.
To physically bypass maritime choke points?
Yes, to shift geopolitical centers of gravity away from Western institutions and lay down the digital infrastructure for the next century. But we've also seen that it is a project fighting immense gravity.
It is facing serious resistance.
It is wrestling with intense accusations of debt traps, tragic safety and engineering failures, glaring environmental contradictions, and a growing list of major economies heading for the exit.
It's not a smooth road at all.
You as a listener should care about this, because the routes we discussed today, whether they are maritime lanes carved through the Mediterranean, freight railways snaking through Central Asia, or fiber optic cables resting beneath the ocean floor, will dictate the future of global commerce.
And international tech standards.
And the baseline of geopolitical stability for decades to come.
The world is physically and digitally reorganizing itself in real time. And understanding the evolving mechanics of the Belt and Road Initiative is truly the only way to read the new map.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Something for you to mull over that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
As we see major countries like Italy and Brazil drop out, and as massive physical infrastructure projects face intense hurdles with local corruption, tragic safety failures like we saw in Serbia, and crushing sovereign debt loads, what if the true lasting legacy of the Belt and Road Initiative isn't physical at all?
That's a fascinating question.
If pouring concrete and laying steel across foreign borders becomes too politically fraught, too heavily scrutinized, and simply too expensive for China to export as nations push back, perhaps the ultimate manifestation of this grand global strategy will be the invisible, frictionless digital Silk Road.
The data networks.
Exactly. While the world's politicians argue over ports and railways, the quiet, persistent routing of the world's data through Chinese-built fiber optics, servers, and smart city tech might be the real permanent shift in global power.
It's definitely the space to watch.
Keep an eye on that the next time you read a headline about a developing nation upgrading its tech infrastructure. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and please keep questioning the world around you.